You know, there's a specific kind of silence that happens right before someone gives up on being loved properly. It doesn't look dramatic from the outside. No big argument, no final message, no cinematic goodbye. It usually looks like a man sitting alone at night, phone in his hand, thinking, maybe I should just stop trying. Maybe this isn't meant for me. And if you're here listening to me right now, there's a part of you that already feels that weight, isn't there? Before we go any further, I want you to do something small for me, not because I'm asking, but because something in you needs it. If this conversation resonates even slightly, just like this video and stay with me. Not for me, but for that part of you that still hasn't given up completely, even if it's tired of hoping. Now listen carefully. I'm not going to tell you a fairy tale where love is always obvious, easy, or loud. Real love, real, grounded, imperfect human love, doesn't always announce itself in the ways you expect. And that's where most men misunderstand it. They look for certainty in something that was never designed to feel certain all the time. I've sat with men who walked away from relationships not because there was no love, but because they didn't recognize it in time. They were waiting for constant reassurance, constant warmth, constant emotional clarity from someone who actually loved them in a quieter, more complicated way. And I need you to hear this without defensiveness. Sometimes the person who truly cares about you doesn't express it in a way that feels emotionally safe for you at first. Not because the love is missing, but because your nervous system is used to chaos, not steadiness. So steadiness feels like distance, and that misunderstanding can cost you something real. I want to slow this down with you. Think about the last time you felt unsure about someone, not because they didn't show up at all, but because they didn't show up in the exact emotional language you were hoping for. Maybe they were consistent, but not expressive, or caring, but not constant in the way you imagined. And instead of asking, what if this is a different kind of love? You asked, what if I don't matter enough? That shift, that tiny internal sentence, is where so many endings begin too early. Because real connection doesn't just challenge your heart, it challenges your interpretation of love itself. Stay with me, because what I'm going to show you next might quietly change the way you've been reading people your entire life. There's something I've noticed over the years that most people don't want to admit out loud. Men don't usually leave love because it's absent. They leave because they can't decipher it in time. And I don't mean that in a poetic way. I mean it in a very practical, psychological sense. If you grow up learning that love should feel a certain way, clear, warm, consistently affirming, then anything outside of that pattern starts to feel like uncertainty, even danger. So when someone shows care in a quieter rhythm, you don't always register it as love. You register it as confusion. Let me slow this down with something real. I once had a conversation with a man who told me, she cared, I know she did, but I always felt like I was guessing. And when I asked him what guessing meant, he paused. Not because he didn't know, but because he did, and it was uncomfortable to say it clearly. He meant she didn't always reassure him in the way he expected. She didn't constantly verbalize her emotions, but she showed up. She remembered details. She adjusted her behavior around what mattered to him. She stayed consistent when things weren't easy. But his mind kept asking, why doesn't it feel like love? And this is where something subtle happens inside you. You start to distrust consistency if it doesn't come wrapped in emotional intensity. You start to assume that calm equals lack of feeling, that stability equals indifference. But that's not always true. Sometimes it's just maturity, or emotional restraint, or someone trying not to overwhelm you with their own internal world. And here's the part I want you to really sit with. Not everyone who loves you will express it in a way that makes you feel emotionally certain every single day. Some people love you in actions before words. Some people love you in patterns instead of declarations. Some people love you in the way they stay, even when the emotional language between you is imperfect. But if you're used to emotional volatility, that kind of love can feel strangely quiet, almost easy to misinterpret. And I need to be careful here because I'm not telling you to ignore your intuition. I'm not telling you to tolerate emotional neglect. That's not what this is. What I am saying is something more uncomfortable. Sometimes the problem isn't that love isn't there. It's that you've been trained to only recognize love when it feels urgent. And urgency is not the same as depth. Take a moment with that. Because if you've ever walked away from something stable thinking, it didn't feel like enough, it might be worth asking yourself a harder question. Did it not feel like enough? Or did it just not feel like what you were used to calling love? And I want to go deeper with you next, because this is where things start to get emotionally complicated, where attachment, fear, and self-worth quietly start shaping your decisions without you even realizing it. There's a moment in relationships that almost no one talks about, because it doesn't look dramatic enough to be memorable. It's not a breakup, it's not a fight, it's something quieter. It's the moment you start interpreting someone's silence through your fear instead of through their behavior. You know that feeling. You send a message and they don't reply in the time you expected, and something in your chest shifts. Not because anything has happened, but because your mind fills the space with meaning. They're losing interest. They don't care the same way. I probably misread everything. And just like that, your emotional reality changes, without a single new fact. Now listen closely, because this is where I want to slow everything down with you. Sometimes, the person you're thinking about, the one you're unsure of, might actually care in ways that don't immediately translate into reassurance for you. They might be steady where you are anxious, reserved where you are expressive, or even thoughtful but not reactive. And if you're not aware of that difference, your mind can quietly rewrite the story. I've seen this pattern so many times. A man starts out connected, even deeply so, but over time begins to feel emotionally unanchored. Not because the other person changed, but because his internal expectations of what love should feel like keep colliding with how that person naturally expresses it. And eventually he starts doing something very human but very costly. He starts testing, not always consciously. Sometimes it looks like pulling away to see if they follow, or becoming colder to see if they notice, or overanalyzing tone, timing, punctuation, searching for emotional certainty in places where certainty was never guaranteed. But here's what I need you to understand. Love that is real doesn't always perform itself on demand, and people who love deeply are not always emotionally loud. There are individuals who care about you more than you realize, but they don't manage their emotions in ways that constantly reassure your nervous system. Instead, they assume stability is enough. They assume presence is proof. And if you've been conditioned to equate love with intensity, unpredictability, or constant emotional feedback, then stability can feel almost like absence. That's the painful irony. You can be standing in something real and still feel like you're losing it. But I also want to be responsible with you here, because not every confusion means love is present. Sometimes distance is distance. Sometimes inconsistency is exactly what it looks like. And part of emotional maturity is learning the difference between a nervous system reacting and reality actually shifting. The challenge is that both can feel identical in the moment, and that's where so many men get stuck. Not in lack of love, but in lack of clarity about their own emotional patterns. So I want you to ask yourself something quietly, without pressure. When you feel uncertain about someone, are you responding to what they're actually doing? Or are you responding to what uncertainty feels like inside you? Because those are not the same thing. And if you stay with me, I'm going to take you deeper into something even more uncomfortable, but also more freeing. How love can exist in someone's behavior long before it feels emotionally safe in your body. I want to tell you something that might sound almost too simple at first, but it changes everything if you really let it land. Not all love feels safe before it feels real, and not all real love feels recognizable before you've learned its language. There's a gap between what is happening and what your body is willing to believe. And most people don't realize they're living inside that gap. Let me explain it in a way that isn't abstract. Have you ever been with someone who shows care in steady, grounded ways, but instead of feeling comforted, you feel slightly restless, like you're waiting for something to prove itself? You start scanning, looking for emotional spikes, waiting for a moment that confirms, yes, this is love. And when that moment doesn't arrive in the form you expect, your mind quietly fills in the blank with doubt. But here's what's often happening underneath that. Your nervous system is not used to calm connection. It's used to emotional uncertainty or emotional effort. So when something is stable, it doesn't register as love. It registers as unfinished. And I need you to hear this clearly. That doesn't mean you're broken. It means your emotional reference points were formed in a different environment. Now, I've had men tell me things like, if she really loved me, I wouldn't have to think this much. And I understand that instinct. We want love to feel obvious, clean, undebatable. But real human connection doesn't always arrive in clean packaging. Sometimes it arrives in consistency that doesn't feel exciting, or care that doesn't announce itself, or presence that doesn't constantly demand attention to be noticed. And if you're not careful, you can mistake not emotionally stimulating for not meaningful. There's also another layer here that's harder to admit. Sometimes when love is steady, there's no emotional chase, no uncertainty to solve, no highs and lows to interpret. And for someone who has learned to equate intensity with connection, that steadiness can feel like something is missing. But what's missing might not be love. It might be the emotional chaos you were unconsciously used to. And I want to pause here with you for a second, because this is where a lot of people make irreversible decisions. They walk away from something consistent, not because it was wrong, but because it didn't activate the emotional patterns they were familiar with. And later, they don't always miss the person. They miss the feeling of being wanted in a way they could feel immediately. There's a difference. I'm not asking you to romanticize confusion. I'm not asking you to ignore your boundaries or stay in situations that drain you. That's not the point here. The point is quieter and maybe more unsettling. Sometimes love doesn't fail you. Sometimes you just don't recognize it while it's happening. And if you've ever looked back and thought, why did that feel uncertain when it was actually stable? This is the space where that question begins to make sense. Because love isn't only about who shows up. It's also about what you're capable of recognizing when they do. There's a kind of clarity people feel right before they walk away from something that actually mattered. And I put clarity in quotes on purpose, because it isn't always clarity. Sometimes it's just emotional overload finally settling into a story the mind can tolerate. Let me say that again in a simpler way. When something feels uncertain for long enough, the mind stops waiting for answers and starts building conclusions instead. It prefers a painful story that feels solid over an uncomfortable reality that stays unclear. So you hear thoughts like, this isn't right for me. I'm not being treated how I should be. I don't feel enough. And sometimes those thoughts are true. Sometimes they're absolutely valid. But sometimes they're also a way of escaping uncertainty rather than understanding it. And here's where things get psychologically interesting. When you're emotionally activated, when you feel anxious, unsure, or slightly rejected, you are not interpreting reality in a neutral state. You're interpreting it through a nervous system that's trying to protect you from further discomfort. So what happens? Small gaps become meaning, delays become rejection, ambiguity becomes conclusion, and suddenly you're not responding to the person anymore. You're responding to the internal pressure that wants the feeling to stop. I've seen this pattern in men who are actually in relationships with people who care about them, but who express themselves in a way that doesn't constantly soothe insecurity. And instead of saying, I feel activated, I need to understand this better, they say something much faster. I don't think this is love. And maybe sometimes it isn't, but sometimes that sentence is not truth, it's relief. Because certainty, even painful certainty, feels calmer than emotional ambiguity. Now I want to bring you closer to something personal. There might be someone in your mind right now, someone you're unsure about, someone you've been analyzing, replaying, questioning. And I want to ask you something gently. Are you trying to understand them? Or are you trying to escape how uncertain you feel around them? Because those are two very different psychological movements. One leads to clarity, the other leads to exits. And here's the part most people don't hear often enough. Leaving doesn't always mean you saw the truth. Sometimes it just means you reached your emotional limit. There are people who leave relationships not because there was no care, but because they couldn't tolerate not fully understanding the care that was there. And I want to be very responsible here again, because I'm not telling you to stay where you're confused. Confusion matters. Emotional neglect matters. Inconsistency matters. But I am saying this, not every moment of doubt is a signal to leave. Sometimes it's a signal to slow down your interpretation. Because when you're in a heightened emotional state, your conclusions feel very real, even when they're still forming. And if you've ever left something and later thought, I might have reacted too fast, then you already know what I'm pointing to here. There is a difference between insight and emotional urgency. One is quiet, the other is loud. And the louder voice is not always the wiser one. There's a strange moment in some connections where everything looks almost right. Not perfect, not cinematic, just quietly, almost right. And that almost is where a lot of people panic, because your mind starts asking, if this is good, why don't I feel completely certain? If this is love, why isn't it fully clear? And I want to sit with that question with you for a moment because it reveals something important about how we've been trained to think about relationships. We've been taught, directly and indirectly, that real love should feel like immediate emotional resolution. Like all doubt disappears. Like your body relaxes completely and never questions again. But real human connection doesn't work like a solved equation. It breathes, it adjusts, it reveals itself in layers over time. And sometimes the early layers don't feel emotionally satisfying. They feel incomplete, like you're missing a piece of the story. But here's the part people don't always notice. Not all missing pieces are signs something is wrong. Sometimes they're just signs you haven't lived enough of the story yet. Let me make this more personal. Imagine someone shows you care in ways that are steady, consistent, and not overly performative. They check in. They remember things. They don't play emotional games. They don't create chaos. But they also don't constantly reassure you in the exact emotional rhythm you're used to. So instead of feeling calm, you feel slightly unanchored, and your mind starts trying to solve it. What is this? Why doesn't it feel stronger? Why do I still have doubts? And slowly, without noticing, you begin to evaluate the connection not by what it is, but by how certain it makes you feel in the moment. But certainty is not always a measure of truth. Sometimes it's just familiarity. And I want you to hear this carefully. If your emotional system has learned to associate love with intensity, unpredictability, or emotional spikes, then stability will not immediately feel like love. It will feel like something is missing. Not because it is missing, but because your internal reference point is still adjusting. Now, I'm not saying stay in confusion. I'm not saying force meaning where there is none. You still need honesty. You still need emotional reciprocity. You still need respect. But I am suggesting something more subtle. Sometimes what feels emotionally flat at first is not lack of love. It's lack of emotional familiarity. And unfamiliarity is often misread as absence. I've watched people walk away from connections that were slowly becoming something real, not because there was harm, but because the early emotional language didn't immediately translate into certainty. And later, they don't always say, I made a mistake. Sometimes they say something more quiet. I just didn't feel it. But what they often mean is, I didn't feel it in the way I knew how to recognize it at the time. And that difference matters more than most people realize, because love doesn't always arrive fully legible. Sometimes it requires you to stay present long enough to understand its dialect. There's a moment I think most people remember later, even if they try not to. It doesn't always stand out at the time. It's subtle, almost forgettable. It's the moment someone was still there, still showing up in their own imperfect way, and you were already halfway gone emotionally. Not physically, not yet, but internally, you had started detaching. And what makes this moment so complicated is that nothing bad has necessarily happened. There wasn't always betrayal. There wasn't always neglect. Sometimes there was just a growing sense of uncertainty that neither person fully knew how to name in time. And uncertainty, when it's not held with understanding, turns into distance. Let me slow this down with you. There are people who don't realize they are being loved while they are being loved. Not because the love is hidden, but because their attention is focused on what is still uncertain instead of what is already present. So they miss the consistency. They overlook the effort. They question the intention. And slowly, the connection becomes something they are evaluating rather than experiencing. Now, I want to be very careful here because I'm not trying to romanticize confusion. I'm not telling you to stay in situations where you feel unseen, disrespected, or emotionally alone. That would not be honest, and it would not be kind. But I am pointing to something more nuanced. Sometimes people leave not because love wasn't there, but because their nervous system reached a point where uncertainty felt heavier than connection. And when that happens, the mind does something very human. It tries to make the decision feel absolute, clean, final. It's not right. This isn't for me. I don't feel it anymore. Because finality feels calmer than emotional ambiguity. But the truth underneath those sentences is often more complex than we allow ourselves to admit. Sometimes what's actually happening is, I feel too much uncertainty to stay present and find clarity. And I want you to sit with that, not as a judgment, but as awareness. Because if you've ever walked away from someone and later felt a quiet sense of unfinished understanding, it doesn't always mean you made the wrong choice. But it might mean you didn't have enough clarity about what you were reacting to at the time. And now, I want to bring this back to the title of what we've been circling around this entire time. This person truly loves you. Don't quit. That sentence is not a command. It's not a guarantee. It's not something you should blindly apply to every situation. It's a reflection. Because sometimes there really is love there, but it doesn't feel stable enough in your body yet for you to trust it. And sometimes the most painful thing is not the absence of love, but the inability to recognize it before distance grows too large to repair easily. So maybe the real question isn't, do they love me? Maybe it's, can I slow down enough to actually understand what I'm feeling before I decide what it means? Because love, real love, doesn't always fail loudly. Sometimes it just gets lost in interpretation. And if this video has stayed with you all the way to this point, I don't want you to leave with certainty about someone else. I want you to leave with a little more honesty about your own patterns, because that's where real clarity actually begins.